Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And he's a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all grand. That's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's Sunday night, the 5th of November, 2023. It is Bonfire Night in Britain, and if you're not familiar with the legend, it's when the more militant wing of the persecuted Catholic population in Britain tried to blow up Parliament when it was being addressed by James I of England and VI of Scotland, one of the first joint monarchs that Britain had. And ironically enough, a man who would later be accused of crypto-Catholicism by the Protestant radicals, and whose son would be accused of trying to restore Catholicism in Britain by Scottish Covenanters and English Puritans, leading, of course, or that's part of the process which leads to the English Civil War. And this is what is being celebrated, or more to the point, what is being celebrated in Britain is, of course, the failure of what is referred to as the Gunpowder Plot and the execution of the conspirators, including Fawkes, who was hanged, drawn and quartered, and his various limbs were sent apparently to the four corners of Britain. So, a reminder of just how far the ruling class will go. And I think that's pretty much what Nigel Farage and wee Douglas Murray would want to do to everybody who goes on pro-Palestinian demonstrations. But more of those tedious frauds later on. I will begin by doing the customary roll call through the chat. So far we have Philbin, who brings greetings and solidarity from Rhode Island, USA. We have James Graham. We have Jay Londonono. And we have Peter, my fellow resident of the ever-perfidious Albion. We have Mike Martinez, who says victory to the Palestinian resistance. And that kind of language could get you chucked out of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. More on that later. DE, hello, and good evening to Lee, and Rob, and Heidi, and good evening to Zuleika. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the situation in the Middle East and where things might be going. And then we'll move on to a couple of other things as well that I wanted to mention. Before beginning, though, I'll just give a big shout out to all my comrades I ran into yesterday at the CPGBML celebration of the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of really interesting speakers there, including comrade Steve Sweeney and comrades from the Pole of Communist Refoundation in France. The French comrade gave a very interesting speech. There was South Korean comrades there talking about the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. And a lot of interesting things said also by representatives from the Embassy of the DPRK and Embassy of the People's Republic of China, and representative from the Cuban diplomatic mission in Britain, and of course the Venezuelan ambassador. So a lot of interesting stuff done there. Ended with a rousing chorus of the Soviet national anthem and the International. All very inspiring stuff, and a big hello to all the comrades I met there in person, some of them at least for the first time. Remind you of your history and what you're fighting for. And with that, we move to the discussion of what is going on in the Middle East. Because, of course, what is going on there is, in so many ways, still has echoes of the Bolshevik Revolution. As one experienced comrade pointed out to me yesterday, the fact that Hassan Nasrallah often sounds almost like a Marxist when he speaks is itself a tribute to the lasting impact of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, where are we now in the Middle East? Well, of course, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State and failed rock musician, has gone on another tour around the Middle East, and he's trying to bring some of the more pro-American regimes, some of the more compliant or traditionally compliant regimes into line behind what Blinken is trying to do. So what is Blinken trying to do? There's a lot of talk from the White House at the moment about needing a humanitarian pause or needing a ceasefire. But Trudeau, by the way, in his typical style, a man who, by the way, some people say he's intelligent. I just don't believe it for a second. The man, he might have some brains, but he's been in this closed circle of reaction for so long, he has become stupid by default. So he gave the game away saying we need a ceasefire. I didn't mean that, humanitarian pause. Of course, Netanyahu is not going to give them that. Even if people say Blinken is trying and the US is trying to pressure Netanyahu, they're not, by the way. What they're actually trying to achieve, and Netanyahu knows this very well, which is why he is not agreeing to this, is they are trying principally to do two things. One is to take the pressure off Biden domestically, or the Democratic Party domestically, because they've now got a serious problem inside the United States, which is that hundreds of thousands were mobilized yesterday, even in Washington, D.C. Apparently it was 300,000 people in Washington, D.C. yesterday, demonstrating against the Israeli war and Biden's complicity within it. And this is on top of demonstrations that are on a smaller scale that have taken place across the United States, even in areas where you would not expect demonstrations of this kind to be taking place. But then again, there are now very significant Palestinian, Arab and Muslim populations in every major urban center, and some minor ones as well across the United States. And it's pulling upon tensions within the Democratic Party and revealing, well, first of all, revealing Bernie Sanders to be who he always was and always will be, which is a bloodthirsty imperialist who periodically makes a social democratic noise. And I'm glad he's come out fully behind Netanyahu, and I hope that everybody who voted for him, who saw him as something positive, gets a good look at who he really is, because he hasn't changed. This is a man who endorsed the war on Yugoslavia, who voted for the Iraq Liberation Act, which paved the way for the invasion of Iraq. That was under Clinton, who agreed with the war on Afghanistan and its continued occupation, who backed the war on Syria, who backed the war on Libya and the restoration of slavery there, by the way, and who has backed almost every war the US has waged since about 1993, with the sole exception of the Iraq War. And that was because it was being waged by George W. Bush. If it had been waged by Al Gore, he'd have been all on board for it. So this is who Sanders is. Him backing Netanyahu 100% is no surprise. And so get a good look at the big hero. That's who the American left wanted to get behind a few years ago. And I don't blame anybody who's too young to have known any better. We all make political mistakes. It's how we learn. But for people who are older and have a greater degree of knowledge, or at least should have, to still be trying to sell this fraud as anything other than what he is, that is inexcusable. So, to return to the point, Biden, and more particularly the Democrats, are now developing a serious problem for themselves in that the part of the electoral coalition that they need to beat Trump, and it probably is going to be Trump, unless, of course, they manage to send him to prison. It is going to be Trump next year. And if the Arab and Muslim vote, together with younger, leftish, progressive types, doesn't turn out for let's say it's Biden, then what they're going to do is they're going to lose to Trump, because Trump's vote will turn out. And they'll try and blackmail all of these voters saying, oh, well, Trump's going to be 10 times worse. Well, if you look at this situation, Trump has the same policy as Biden. Trump's just not pretending, and I'm coming to what they're pretending about in a moment. Trump's just being completely what he's always been, which is a narcissistic lunatic who, even though he's an egotistical maniac and incredibly self-interested, is still not quite as crazy as Biden. He's perhaps even more cynical. But they're going to try and blackmail people back into line, but I don't think it's going to work. I think this slaughter in Gaza is now gone too far. Biden is too publicly associated with it, having gone over there and given Netanyahu a blank check. And now he's worried, or somebody in the White House is worried, that Netanyahu is cashing that check, which of course he was always going to. Don't know how they thought that this was going to go down any differently. But they have been surprised by the domestic opposition, and they are worried about it, which is why they want to try and take the sting out of things. And how do they try and take the sting out of things? They are probably, and I'm guessing now, telling Netanyahu, look, stop for a couple of days. Let us get humanitarian aid in a big way, and then you can start again. Just give us enough to take the sting out of the situation, not only in the United States, but also in Canada and across the whole of Western and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in certain places as well. Serbia, I think Bulgaria, there's been pro-Palestinian demonstrations. There was one on Sardinia yesterday where there's a big NATO base. And what they're worried about, and they're right to be worried about it, is that this Palestinian solidarity mood is quickly becoming an anti-US and anti-NATO mood, which is, by the way, exactly what we need it to become. We need these populations of the European working classes to look at what's being done now, to connect it to the presence of US bases all the way across the country, and to direct their anger at the ongoing US occupation of Europe, and to campaign and to fight for its removal and the dismantling of NATO. That's, by the way, why the ruling class in Britain is going bananas and screaming and getting hysterical, because they're realizing that this is where it's going. And so for all those reasons, they need Netanyahu to calm down. Well, not calm down, to give them a pause so that they can take it out of the headlines. This is what they're hoping, that they can take it out of the headlines, that they can make it look as if the situation's calmed down. And that will also help them in terms of maintaining their relationships with the otherwise compliant stooges in the Arab world. So, for instance, the kings of Jordan, the president of Egypt, Al-Sisi, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who's gone a bit rogue, but still was seeking normalization with Israel until this happened. And these regimes are facing huge popular pressure in their own countries, and they can't back up the US publicly when this is going on. They'll still do it privately. So the giving of the blank check to Netanyahu has, of course, created a huge number of problems for the United States across the Middle East. US imperialism is now facing its key allies coming under enormous domestic pressure to the point where you have to ask how long is it before one of them is either overthrown or flips and starts taking more hostile action against Israel. So Biden and, well, let's say Blinken and others in the administration who have put together this strategy have created an absolutely enormous problem for themselves. In that by backing Israel, they lose potentially their other comprador regimes in the Arab world. So they've now got a real problem. They need to try and publicly calm this down. Of course, Netanyahu can't do that. He cannot stop now, because then he views this correctly from his perspective as if he stops now, that's a victory for Hamas, or more specifically, that's a victory for the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. And also, it's a defeat and a public defeat for him, and will mark the end of his term as Prime Minister. He will not be coming back after this. He knows that the only way he can politically survive and stay out of prison is that if he's able to deliver something that at least looks like a victory. He can't do that at the moment. They're on the ground in Gaza. They are apparently taking, even by the admission of the Israeli Minister of Defense, the lunatic Yoav Gallant, taking heavy casualties on the ground in northern Gaza in the fighting with the Palestinian forces there. So he can't stop now, even for a day, even for a few hours, because otherwise, if that happens, then he's finished. He has to keep going. And Netanyahu has based his political career to a large degree upon a very accurate understanding of the role that Israel plays for US imperialism and British imperialism, as Nasrallah correctly pointed out the other day, in the Middle East, which is that Israel is the attack dog, and that's what its value is. And also he knows that he doesn't have to agree to anything any single US president says, because he knows that the wider interests of US imperialism have, as part of their, shall we say, as part of their core expression in the Middle East, as part of that core is Israel. And without Israel acting as it was set up to do by the British originally with the Balfour Declaration 106 years ago, without that, then the US loses a key weapon in keeping the Arab countries divided and weak. And Israel is a key part of that strategy, as originally designed by Britain. And Netanyahu knows that Israel is crucial for that strategy, which is why he can give the finger to various US presidents when he feels he has the need to. Because he knows very well that Biden, or whoever is making the decisions in the White House at this stage, cannot come out and do the one thing or the two things that would actually secure an Israeli back down. And people saying, oh, Netanyahu's out of control, Israel's out of control. No, Israel is doing what the US allows it to do. Yes, would Blinken prefer a pause for a day or two to try and take this debt out of the headlines? Yes, they would. But bear in mind that headline and public image manipulation is all they're really interested in. They're not actually interested in stopping the mass murder that Netanyahu was engaging in. They're interested in getting it off the front pages, calming down the domestic political situation, and stopping things both internationally escalating against the US, and things inside the Middle East escalating against the US even further. That's what they want to do. So it's not out of any humanitarianism that they're calling for this. They're trying to find a way out temporarily while still being able to grant the Israeli state what it needs to secure itself a victory. Now, of course, Netanyahu, again, he understands this, and he understands that Biden won't make the two threats that would make a difference. And that is, if Biden, or whoever is making the decisions, said to Netanyahu, right, if you don't stop now, we are not refilling the ammunition for your Iron Dome facilities. We are not giving you any more air defense. We will not back you up if this leads to a wider war. You will get no air support. You will get no more ammunition. You will get no funding out of Congress. We'll block all the bills that Congress sends. You're not going to get jack shit, basically, unless you stop this now. And it would stop. Because you see the sheer number of transport planes flying into Israel containing hundreds and hundreds of rounds or thousands of rounds of artillery shells, ammunition of all kinds, munitions for the aircraft, and of course the armada that the US and the Europeans have assembled in the Mediterranean to back up Israel in the case of a wider war. Well, if Biden said, you're on your own, not only are we cutting you off in terms of military supplies, in terms of money, but we will no longer veto resolutions against you at the United Nations. You will be completely on your own, Netanyahu, unless you call this off. And he'd have to call it off because he's got nowhere else to go. He can't turn to the Russians. He can't turn to the Chinese. He can't turn to anybody else. Without the United States, there is no Israel. And the only American president, funnily enough, who actually made use to a small degree of that threat was George H.W. Bush when he wanted to shove the Israelis into the Oslo process, which was never meant to be anything other than a joke anyway. But Bush didn't like the fact that I think it was Yitzhak Shamir at the time was defying him. So he says, right, you either do what I fucking say or you get cut off. And the Israelis had to do what he fucking said. So when you're looking at this and they're saying, oh, well, Blinken can't restrain Netanyahu, of course he could. It's just that Netanyahu knows very well that the key pressure points are the arming and the funding of the state of Israel, that the US imperialists, no matter who is in the White House, will not touch at this stage. Because if they did that, not only would it be the end of Netanyahu, it would also provoke a gigantic crisis within the Israeli state itself, possibly, again, going up to the point of perhaps open civil war within Israel, which it was nearly at anyway. So they can't, the US imperialists can't pull the trigger on the ultimate sanctions that would actually stop the Israelis from rampaging around Gaza. They are desperate to try and preserve their alliances in the Arab countries with the comprador regimes there, but can't. They want to keep Erdogan and the Turks on side, which so far Erdogan's just made noises, but there are signs of more radicalization in the Turkish protests. There's crowds of Turks heading to US military bases to try and rush inside them. Quite what the role of the Turkish state is in those protests, I don't know. I don't know enough about that as yet. But certainly it's pushing Erdogan into a position where he's now got to say, I no longer can deal with Netanyahu, who he was happy to deal with before, by the way. Nothing about any of this should surprise anyone. Netanyahu has always been this low-down, wretched criminal. But the fact is that the US imperialists are in a mess. They can't go forward. For those who say that they want a war with Iran, well, they can't, as I've said before, they can't fight a war with Iran. They can't fight a war with Iran just launching planes off aircraft carriers. As to the position of Hezbollah, well, we know now that in 6 days' time, next Saturday, the 11th of November, Saeed Nasrallah will make another speech in which is on the Martyrs' Day, I think, in Lebanon. And he will then comment upon, well, presumably what has happened since his previous intervention. Because if you recall his speech, Nasrallah was saying, essentially, that the crimes of Israel are the crimes of US imperialism. And US imperialism could stop Israel anytime it wanted to. And this is, of course, entirely correct, as I've just talked about. And so what Nasrallah was outlining there is that unless you stop Israel, it will be your interests in the Middle East which are going to start getting hit even more. And that goes for the US base that they're continuing to occupy in Syria, and it goes for what the US has got left in Iraq too, which are under increasing levels of attack. So essentially, Nasrallah has given the US a week to stop this, which is why they are sort of they're trying to do the bare minimum to make it look as if they have. They won't even manage to do that, of course, because, again, Netanyahu, due to his own political position and the toxic combination of political parties in his coalition, can't stop. Now you've got demonstrations inside Israel itself. The first, anti-government demonstrations that at least some of the protests there, at least, are dedicated to campaigning for a ceasefire. So you've now got the re-emergence of some kind of domestic Israeli peace movement, and that's on top of the already big divisions that existed inside Israel. So again, for all those reasons, Netanyahu's not going to stop. He needs to win his war. He won't be able to, as, again, Nasrallah correctly observes. Like the plan, according to the journalist Elijah Manier, who's had many years of reporting on Israel and the Middle Eastern wars, the plan that they have is to empty the northern part of Gaza, which is why they're bombing those hospitals. They're trying to terrorize all of the civilian population into leaving, in the belief that that will then make their job of fighting the Palestinian armed forces on the ground easier. So far, it doesn't look as if that's the case. It looks as if the Palestinian fighters are every bit as capable as we thought they were, in fact, more so. Certainly, they are incredibly brave and far braver than the Israelis. So think Scott Ritter's estimate that they would need to basically prepare for over 10,000 casualties if they aim to go into the tunnels under Gaza and do what they've now said they have to do, which is root out Hamas. Well, then they're going to lose thousands and thousands of men. So if that's actually what they want to do. But they've rhetorically, because they keep making these grandiose statements, like Netanyahu and Gallant and others keep saying, we're going to destroy Hamas. And then you get various maniacs in the Knesset going, oh, well let's just kill everybody in Gaza. So what that reveals isn't a state and government in the form of Israel that knows what it's doing and has a clear plan. They have something of a plan, but then their objectives, they keep amplifying new objectives every 10 minutes, adding new objectives, taking away objectives, because it's clear that there are different factions within the Israeli so-called unity government which are fighting it out. The fact that you now have anti-Netanyahu protests breaking out all over Israel is only going to add to the tensions inside that coalition. And the more pressure that the protest movement across Europe, across Britain, Ireland, the United States, and other places like Canada can build up and take this in an anti-US imperialism direction, in an anti-NATO direction, the more pressure gets heaped upon the US imperialists to finally pull that trigger, which is to say to Netanyahu, you have to stop, otherwise we're cutting you off. Because there will reach a point, and we will reach this point at some point, possibly soon, if things continue this way, where the wider interests of US imperialism start to depart from the maintenance of the state of Israel. There will be a point where that happens. We're not there yet, by quite some distance. But if we get to the point where Biden is under enormous domestic pressure because of an increasingly gigantic protest movement that starts to draw in other elements into it as well. So you build it up into an anti-US imperialism movement as a whole, not just something which is against Netanyahu or against Israel, even though it's important to start with that. Build it up inside the United States into a coherent anti-imperialist movement, even if its main line is going to be that of a more pacifistic peace movement. You can start to build a serious anti-imperialist movement inside the US as part of that, which should be something that the US imperialists and the federal government will be desperate to stop happening, and they'll use every means at their disposal to try and stop that. But if we also build it up in Europe and Canada and elsewhere, in all the other countries in NATO, to the point where it becomes a challenge to the existence of NATO itself, then you are going to be seeing the point where the US has to make a choice. The US imperialists will have to make a choice. Is it going to be the preservation of their wider military alliances in the form of NATO, or are they going to risk it all to stick with the Israeli colonial project? That's going to provoke a severe crisis within the higher echelons of US imperialism. And they know that, which is why they're desperate to stop this protest movement growing any further. But there's an awful lot of dissatisfaction and anger inside the United States. And I hope that this can be built on and incorporated into a wider movement. Certainly we could do with doing that in Britain, because we've now got the most vibrant protest movement we've had in many, many years, and it would be a shame to leave it in the hands of a bunch of Labour Party people who would run it into the ground. So to reiterate, the US imperialists are not aiming to really restrain Israel at this stage. What they are looking for is a way to try and manipulate the media and the headlines to make it look as if things have calmed down, and for that to happen, they need a temporary cessation in the bombing campaign. They need to get some images in there of aid trucks going in en masse. They need to try and present an image of the situation that gives the comprador regimes in Egypt and Saudi and Jordan enough of a fig leaf to say to their populations, look, our pressure worked. A pause has been reached. We are now working to resolve the situation, that kind of thing. But they've run into a huge problem, which is that the Israeli regime cannot stop. If it stops, it loses. And they know that. So now we are faced with a situation where it is, to a certain extent, in our hands to push the protest movement further, to radicalize the demands, to try and turn it into an anti-US imperialism movement, an anti-NATO movement. And that's going to be the thing that pushes this over the edge. If the US imperialists start to see that this is a risk to NATO itself, that might move them to put the requisite pressure on the Israelis, or even to start considering pulling the plug on them. This is where this could go if we look at this in the right way. And you have on top of this the disaster that the US imperialists have created, well, principally for Ukrainians in the proxy war on Russia, where the ludicrous plan that they dreamt up, and which now, according to General Zaluzny in his very self-pitying interview in The Economist, or the article he wrote in The Economist, the plan for the great offensive that was designed by NATO officers, delivered to Ukraine, and then, of course, it turned into the disaster that everybody predicted it was going to be. Well, they're now facing a situation where the Ukrainian forces are, if not collapsing, then are shaking under extreme pressure. The Russians are doing their slow roll advance in Avdiivka and a couple of other places. There is more and more talk of political divisions within the hierarchy of the Ukrainian state. There's all kinds of negative stories coming out about Zelensky. It's clear that many of the imperialists have had enough of him, and they're preparing, or they would be prepared to ditch him if they could lever in what they would regard as an appropriate substitute. And they're desperate to try and make it the case that they can try sort of reach or force Zelensky or somebody else to reach some bargain with the Russians. The problem that they've got, though, is that Putin and the Russian government basically say, well, that's nice, but we don't trust anything you say. And, well, why would they? Given all the things we know that the US imperialists and their stooges lied directly to the Russian government about, and, of course, misled everybody else about as well. So the war will end on Russia's terms, compounding a disaster for US imperialism. So the war in Ukraine turning into a disaster is very much something that is a trap they laid for themselves. And eventually, the wild Zionist madmen in Tel Aviv were going to turn into a problem for the US imperialists, because eventually it became the case that the choice, which is a very impossible one for them, an almost impossible one, is either retain what their fraying influence inside the Middle East outside of Israel or maintain Israel. All of this is coming together to create an absolute crisis for US imperialism, which it is not going to be able to get out of very easily. Somebody is going to have to make very unpalatable choices, and none of the current hierarchy inside the Democratic Party particularly wants to make those. So let's pause for questions from the discussion forum. Well, happy birthday to James Graham, who is celebrating today on the 5th of November. And good evening to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. Check out the Class Consciousness Project website for our latest articles. Jerry, good evening to you, comrade, and good to meet you yesterday. Lord Charfield, good evening to you, comrade, and good to meet you yesterday. And Roddy, evening to you, and same to you. Hope you enjoyed yesterday as much as I did. Bot Noob, good evening. Tony, hello to you. Hello to Slava, my comrade out there in Chicago. Carmo, good evening all the way from the Wirral, quite close to where I am sitting right now. David Green says, one wild card is that polls show that Trump is clearly defeating Biden in 5 of 6 swing states. Yeah. Now, the wild card there to which David is referring is that, as I mentioned previously, now there is another possibility that I didn't actually mention, which is that we've seen American Psycho himself, Gavin Newsom, going to China, elevating his profile, getting a meeting with Xi Jinping, which apparently Biden is struggling to get, and generally putting himself about and looking like he wants to be president, which he clearly does. The other possibility, of course, is that the Democrats decide to cut their losses. They pull the cord on Biden, say, "Okay, Joe, time for you to go to the retirement home in wherever the hell he would choose to be retired off to." Perhaps he was the senator for, where was it, Rhode Island? Am I wrong about that? Or isn't he? He's from Pennsylvania, isn't he? Maybe they'll put him in a retirement home in Scranton. But if they, one possible way out for the Democrats is if they decide to swap out Biden for Newsom, then that might be a way of them trying to get over this hump, because it's now become an impossible situation for them. They could, of course, perhaps try and take the sting out of it, get the Biden administration to be the bad guys and pull the plug to a certain extent in the Middle East, force Netanyahu into a compromise. But even then, the next president's going to pick up an almighty mess when Israel starts to implode. So this is, again, it's a huge problem, but swapping out Biden for American Psycho might be appealing to some of them as a way forward. The other side to what David says there is that some of the Democrats' inclinations will be to just try and use the Trump card, quite literally, the Trump card for them being Trump. So they will then say to their electorate, look, you got to vote for Biden or it's the fascist, which is kind of difficult when Biden's just approved absolute mass slaughter. It's kind of difficult to say that Trump is worse when Biden's just approved of all of that, which is why Biden, even from a narrow perspective of like electoral politics, bourgeois electoral politics, going over there and basically saying, do whatever you want, Benjamin, we've got your back, was an incredibly short-sighted and incredibly stupid thing to do. So we'll see where this goes. Philbin says, you were right about civil disobedience being the next step in movement in the States. Defense company in Massachusetts was occupied, disrupted. An ammo ship in California was boarded. Departure for Israel delayed. Yeah, this is going to be the thing. I mean, you've got this tradition of in the US left of non-violent civil disobedience. However, whatever value we put on that, it's a clear stage to escalate to, which has a basis in the American political history. So that's a stage to go through for many people. And I think communists should be involved in that. And that will also be a concern of the secret police in the United States. The intelligence agencies will be worried about this escalating in more radical directions. And I don't think they expected it either. I think that Israel has been getting away with stuff for so long, and nothing had been seen of the anti-war movement in the United States for so many years that Biden and his crew got caught by surprise. And of course, the social media thing helps with that in terms of getting the horrifying images of Israel's mass slaughters out there. But yeah, the Democrats and the political establishment, both in the United States and in Britain, got completely taken by surprise, which is why they're getting so enraged now. Jay Londonono says, considering everything you've outlined about the humanitarian pause, is the likely outcome here the US pulling a Ukraine and folding on Project Israel in the end? The fall guy is already in place. Well, in the end, Israel will be abandoned. Just as in the end, apartheid South Africa was abandoned. Just as in the end, Rhodesia was abandoned. Just as in the end, the white European settlers in Algeria were abandoned by de Gaulle. At a certain point, the cost for the imperialists becomes too much to bear, especially when they've got a load of other crises in the world going on as well, and they can't afford to be betting everything on maintaining Israel, especially when it becomes a political problem domestically. So in the end, yes, the Zionists will get abandoned. And when that happens, as I've said before, the richer of them will be on a plane to the United States to spend the next 50 years whinging about how Biden betrayed them. And the poorer of them will be left to face the consequences in the Middle East. Thankfully, the liberation movements, both in Lebanon and in Palestine itself, are a lot more enlightened than the leaders of the Zionists ever were, and of which we might say more in future episodes. David Green says, this feels more like 1968 Tet Offensive every day. It's a good point. I mean, the point about the Tet Offensive was that militarily speaking, the Vietnamese National Liberation Front didn't actually win that one. The US was able to defeat it, but it proved that Johnson was a liar and that the Pentagon had been talking shit, saying that they had everything under control when they obviously didn't, because they were attacked right in the middle of what was at the time called Saigon and a load of other urban centers, which were meant to be completely under the control of the South Vietnamese puppet government. And they ended up looking very foolish. And even though the US still managed to inflict more blood and slaughter on the Vietnamese, they still lost that war. And the Tet Offensive should be seen as a crucial step on the road of them being forced out, first forced into a negotiation, which Johnson started and Nixon continued, but then that negotiation imploding all around them because the North Vietnamese, as they were, defeated the South Vietnamese and marched on Saigon. Hence you get the humiliating retreat out of the US embassy via helicopter. But yes, it's a correct point to raise. Good evening to my comrade Ben Kavanagh, another one who was there yesterday. Good to see you, comrade. Brian Kelly, also good to see you yesterday as well. Philbin says, Biden versus Trump debate has literally degraded to Dems arguing they'd be nicer guards to the concentration camp than the GOP, Trump being more overt in Iran war plans. Yeah, I would say that. I mean, he's more over in he's sort of over the top rhetoric, but not by much. If you put him next to Nikki Haley, he looks like a hippie. She's a complete frothing at the mouth lunatic. Now, currently, her obsession seems to be equally between wanting to carry out a mass slaughter of Palestinians and start a war with China. She can't choose, but she's so fucking stupid that she's really useful, as I've said before, because she just puts it out on the line what the U.S. ruling class's interests are. It makes it very easy to demonstrate just how full of shit they are most of the time. But if they're only, I mean, they've tried this blackmail shit. They tried it in 2016, and it didn't work. They tried it in 2020, and I think arguably it just about worked then. There are dubious things about that election, I think to say the least. But the whole question of whether it's going to work or not, I think he's open to debate. It'll work on some people, but I think after all of this, it's going to be very difficult for them to sell Biden, which is why I think the more smarter operators in the Democratic Party will be thinking, we got to get Joe retired. We got to bring in the American Psycho, pack Kamala off to a gin distillery somewhere in California and have her retire. Okay, Biden is from Delaware apparently. I'm already talking about him in the past tense. Arestovich, says DE, is looking to take over from Tony Montana / Zelensky. I have heard it's going to be potentially Zelensky with Arestovich as the I don't know if there's the sort of the power behind the throne, the war hero and the spin doctor basically. But I mean, this is like swapping out Hamid Karzai for Ashraf Ghani. I mean, it's useless. They've still got, again, like the Ukrainian situation is still an insoluble problem, which is that many in the Ukrainian elite, so to speak, would scuttle out of there and basically surrender, but there's too many political forces in Ukraine who'd kill them or try to kill them if they did. So they've got a real problem. And changing Zelensky for Zelensky isn't really going to help them deal with that, given that the Russians aren't really going to do them any favors, and why the hell would they? So let me scroll up there. Right, Iris Partisan says, why would Russia trust the West when the West has broken every agreement that it has signed up to Oslo, 93, Kumanovo, 99 with Yugoslavia, JCPOA with Iran, Minsk agreements, and the incidents in March 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine war. Yeah, that's exactly right. Imperialism breaks every single agreement that it has ever signed, violates it almost immediately. The only agreements they ever maintain is when there is enough of a threat to them and their interests that it is more in their interest to abide by it. Anything else, they're just going to ride roughshod over it. DE says Newsom already has the falling downstairs act in the bag. Oh, is he a drinker? I know he's a wine merchant. Well, maybe he's not that dissimilar from Biden. And DC says muzzle paint was massive, biggest since Gulf War 2.0 in 2003. Excellent stuff. And of course, having it right in the capital city, right in the imperial capital, is going to really piss off all the right people as well, as it's sending the imperialists here into an absolute tailspin of sort of frothing madness. It's to quote an old meme, you love to see it. Right. Cook Sonia says, long-time listener of the podcast, first time I've caught the stream. Seems I'm a bit late, though. Well, you can always catch up on double quick time. Good to have you here. Right. Muzzle Paint says, the vibe in DC was absolutely revolutionary. Nothing like the tourist vibe of the 2016 Women's March. Well, that's excellent. I mean, the the vibe on the Manchester demonstrations so far has been very good. I would say there's more scope for radicalism there than the organisers will allow, and I'll elaborate on that. Recently, on his Substack page, Asa Winstanley had a story about how the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in Britain sacked or suspended, I'm not quite sure which at the moment, their Manchester committee for putting a headline on their website which said victory to the resistance. And of course this was picked up on by the usual reactionary journalists, and by reactionary journalists I mean every journalist who's employed in the bourgeois press is a reactionary journalist. There's no exceptions. This was like The Sun, but it could just have easily have been The Guardian. Picked up on this, and of course, as is always the case with these Labour left figures, they immediately panicked when the bourgeois press had a go at them and started suspending people. And that's why you can't leave the leadership of this in the hands of such people. And this leads us into a discussion I think I'll go into when I've finished reading through the immediate comments about how this is presented, how this is portrayed. Right. And Philbin says there's annually a fascist salute to veterans in Providence, Rhode Island, with torches and floodlights. Your comrade waved Ba'ath-era Iraqi and Palestinian flag in front of every spotlight, confusing the jingoist crowd. Now that is funny. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, and of course this goes back to the whole question of leadership thing, and people brought this up, like CJ in the Telegram group brought this up, which is the portrayal of the Palestinian struggle and how it is visualized in political terms in Britain and the USA, and I think this goes for Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand as well. And that is, of course, that the way in which that they are portrayed is, first of all, by the mainstream or institutional left, is as helpless and perfect victims who need to be protected by the enlightened people of the Western world. So there's that. That's the first way they're portrayed. And that's why you get Palestine Solidarity leadership sacking anybody who says victory to the resistance. That's part of the reason why, because they are in pursuit of a respectable form of bourgeois politics. A lot of these people, even after everything that Keir Starmer has done, a lot of the people who lead the Palestine Solidarity campaign are probably still going to tell you to vote Labour. They might do it a little quieter now after this, but a lot of them are still going to vote Labour. And they're still going to tell other people to vote Labour. And for that sort of respectability politics to have that respectable place within the bourgeois system, then they have to present the Palestinians as being these perfect passive victims. And that's what they need for their style of politics. Now, of course, we reject that style of politics. Now, I'll come on to the communist position in a moment. Then you get, and this is drawing on some things that were written in the Telegram group, which I think were correct. The second one, which is the more slightly better, which will defend in theory the Palestinians' right to resistance against the Israeli occupation. They may even do it with reference to international law. But they will say, oh, God, but Hamas are terrible. We can't have Hamas. Oh, my God, I just wish they were led by somebody else. But they will defend the Palestinians' right to resistance. They will just not want to be associated with the actual vehicle of that resistance. And that's the more left reformist position. It's basically the position of a lot of the so-called communist parties. I mean, you get some ludicrous things going on in this country involving the so-called Communist Party of Britain. They're still going to tell you to vote Labour, by the way. I think I'm going to do more on them tomorrow. But they will say on the one hand that they are in solidarity with the Palestinians. On the other, though, they'll make all kinds of concessions to the Labour Party's position. And that's basically what the slightly more leftish people will say. The other motivation that they've got is that they too want to be like the farthest left of sort of respectable bourgeois politics, whereas the previous group want to be right in the middle of it. Then you have the communist position, which is not only do communists, that is us, defend the right of the Palestinian masses to armed struggle against the occupying power. And it is worth just dwelling on the point that according to various pieces of international law that were actually cited by Nebenzia, Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, that according to international law, Israel is an occupying power and therefore armed resistance is legitimate against it. Now, I don't put much faith in international law, but if you're going to have that kind of debate, it's a useful thing to just throw out there. But communists defend the right of the Palestinians to resist their occupier by force of arms. And not only that, we avoid the opportunist Khrushchevite revisionist position by saying that we fully support the current armed struggle of the Palestinian people against their occupiers, and that this is necessary because it is not for us as outsiders to dictate to the Palestinian masses how their struggle should be conducted or who their national leadership is. And it's again, as I've said this before, it's not fantasy football. It's not pick your ideal liberation fighter, because this is the leadership of the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian national liberation struggle as it is currently constituted. And it is our duty as revolutionaries to support them in their armed struggle and to stand in solidarity with them and not indulge in the respectability politics of Khrushchevite revisionism or nitpick and say, oh, well, I don't like this or that or the other about Hamas. That's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. The central contradiction facing the Palestinians right now is the occupation, and therefore Hamas and their military wing, the Al-Qassam fighters, together with a unified national front, a national liberation front consisting of them, Hamas, of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and certain elements of Fatah, though that's kind of up in the air exactly where the bulk of their forces are going to land on this in the end. They constitute a national liberation army which is fighting a war of national liberation against both the Israeli colonial state and ultimately against US imperialism. And if we are not in support of that, then we have no right to call ourselves communists. We have no right to call ourselves revolutionaries. We are just another group of petty bourgeois nitpickers trying to pursue respectability politics in the imperial core. That's what the so-called communists in Britain are. That's what so many so-called communists in Europe are. And I don't know what the current situation is with regard to the position of the CPUSA. I haven't looked into it yet, but I imagine it's pretty awful. So I wanted to comment on just that as well, because this is the way that this is going is that the bourgeois now, having been panicked and caught by surprise by the way that this movement has blown up, they are now going to try everything in their power to divide it, to confuse it, to weaken it. And in doing that, they know that they will have an enthusiastic ally in the form of some of the people who currently lead it, who, when the bourgeois crack the whip and threaten their place within the established system, and basically let them know that if you continue down this path, there will be no place for you in the future system. That ground that you occupy, that you have been allowed to exist upon as a sort of respectable representative of the Palestinian cause, who can get doors opened for them in certain corridors of power, who is regarded as a legitimate movement by bourgeois politicians. All of that can be taken away, is what the bourgeois are going to say to these leaders, whether it's in the United States or Britain or anywhere else. they all say, well, we can take that all away. We can do a financial investigation into your organization. We can reveal all these secrets about you. We can make you out as a bunch of demons in the bourgeois press. All of that is what they will do. We can try and drum up racial divisions inside the population to try and derail this. We can start trying to stage provocations using some of the pet jihadists that the security services have ready to go. That kind of thing. The British bourgeois are already hinting towards this. In fact, they're not so much hinting, they're screaming about it. There is supposed to be a million-man march for Palestine on the 11th, same day as Nasrallah is speaking, next Saturday. And the bourgeois are freaking out about this because, of course, it's Armistice Day, commemorating the time at which the imperialists of a previous generation decided to call an end to the mass murder of World War I. Now, ironically enough, one of the big reasons why they wanted to bring that war to a close quickly was partly because Germany was undergoing a revolution, and the Kaiser had been subject to an overthrow due to the actions of the German working class, and the German armed forces were rebelling against the German bourgeois, leading the provisional government led by the treacherous Social Democrats to rush to a peace agreement. And that's why they were part of the reason why they were desperate to end that war, that and they were losing it anyway. But also the French and the British imperialists were desperate to end it as well, because of course they now wanted to focus on destroying the revolutionary government that had emerged in Russia, led by, of course, Lenin, Stalin, and others. And for all those reasons, due to revolutionary pressures upon them, they were desperate to bring that war to a close. And so it's worth bearing that in mind when they start screaming about how it's an insult to Armistice Day. What they're worried about is, of course, these protests getting even bigger, to the point where, as I said previously, the question of NATO gets posed, the question of US occupation of Britain gets posed, because the US essentially exists here as a military occupying power to keep their pets in the British bourgeoisie in place, with the willing connivance of the British bourgeoisie since the 1940s, of course, but this is a point that we need to make. So they're whipping up this hysteria about how the war memorials are going to get attacked by jihadists as part of this march. Now, of course, I wouldn't put it past the British ruling class, or their American equivalents for that matter, to stage some kind of provocation. They've got plenty of people who they can send in as provocateurs, either undercover cops or some of those jihadist groups they have a very dubious relationship with, perhaps. But with the proper discipline and control, the march, I imagine, will pass off without any kind of incident. If they try to stage some kind of provocation, and if the march is big enough, then it could go very, very badly for the bourgeois forces themselves. Now, the reason why they have victimized people, they have arrested people, but they haven't waded in and tried and do mass arrests so far, is that the marches have been too big. It would create too many problems for them to try and break them up by force. So if you do get 1 million or close to it in London next week, or perhaps even more, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, the cops don't engage in too many provocations, because if you're going to try and start a ruck with 1 million people, you're going to lose. So I anticipate that if it's 1 million strong, it'll probably pass off without incident. However, they don't rule out some kind of provocations being staged elsewhere in the country, perhaps. But certainly it'll be something that they are desperate to knock on the head as soon as they possibly can. And provocations will be part of that strategy. Philbin says, YouTube AI censors have been redacting more militant and even moderate pro-Palestine posts. Deep apology. I recently mistook this for chat moderator censoring. Okay, well, worth bearing in mind. If this video disappears, it's also available on Odyssey and Rumble, and you can always find the complete back catalogue of every single thing that we've done, including the censored stuff that got deleted by YouTube. It's all on the Patreon page as well. And good morning to Ash down there in Melbourne. I see that the demonstrations got bigger in Australia as well. And it's worth noting, of course, that there's huge demonstrations even in Canada, which I thought was a politically neutered and dead zone. So it only goes to show that even Marxists can get surprised. So this is all going in a very interesting direction, to say the least. And Muzzlepaint says there was a call from speaker stage and repeated throughout the 3 hours of speakers to shut it down on November the 9th. While not a true strike, it could shock the ruling class if activated nationally. Well, that's a demand worth making. I mean, what are they calling for here? If Muzzlepaint can confirm, are they calling for like mass walkouts from workplaces, some kind of like unofficial strike action? Because that'd be a useful demand to be at least aware of, that could perhaps be raised here. So, the bourgeoisie, the imperialist bourgeoisie, are in a mess of their own creation. They have stirred up mass opposition to themselves inside the Middle East and even in the imperial core countries, which is growing every week. More and more people getting radicalized. They are now desperate to shut this down, but they are going to struggle to do so. Netanyahu cannot afford to do them any favors. He is stuck in a trap of his own making, and he cannot get out. He has to go forward. He has to try and secure a military victory, or at least something that can be presented as such, to his rabid fascistic base. And if he can't do that, then he's finished politically, and possibly finished in terms of his presence in Israel itself. He may have to flee to the United States to stay out of prison. The protests kicking off in Israel will further destabilize the situation. We go towards the next speech made by Nasrallah, and notice also that Nasrallah, in coded terms, made an appeal to the populations of the wider Middle East as well. He didn't say openly, come out and defy your governments, but he made points about the feebleness of the Jordanian, Egyptian, Saudi, and Gulf state regimes, which will only add to the pressure on them. So we head towards another week of brutality, but always bear this in mind. Whatever the Israelis do, and whatever barbarity US imperialism commits on their behalf, or I'm just going to say US imperialism was followed Nasrallah's example. And we were already making this point that all of these crimes are the crimes of US imperialism. Anti-imperialist struggles in every country in the last 100 years, especially since World War II, those that are successful are always subjected to all kinds of brutalities from the imperialists, whether it's Algeria and the many that died there, the up to 1 million that died in that war, the 4 million Koreans that were killed, at least 3 million Vietnamese, countless killed in the smaller anti-imperialist struggles in places like Nicaragua, tens of thousands killed in Operation Condor in South America by the US imperialists seeking to physically annihilate revolutionaries and other people who might cause a problem. Countless, again, like anything up to 2 million killed in Indonesia, for instance, in 1965. So all of these struggles, many successful, some suppressed, but even the successful of them were bloody affairs in which the imperialists committed all kinds of horrific crimes before finally having to concede defeat and retreat. Bear this in mind when looking at what is coming out of occupied Palestine. Yes, the US imperialists, via their Israeli colony, are inflicting gigantic barbarities and acts of mass murder on the population. But never make the mistake, which the pacifists and the soft left make, of thinking that this is a weak and defenseless people. They have showed through their actions that that not just the fighters, but the entire people are strong and determined to continue their struggle. The Israelis, as all imperialists do, will commit their barbarities in the hope of breaking the will to fight of the population. Now, they may well, in the end, succeed in some of what they're after. I don't think that they will succeed in their objectives, though. What the Palestinian forces have done is trigger the end game for the Zionist project. It is now in its ending point. The end phase of this struggle may go on for a few more months or even a few more years, but it is the end phase. And by taking this action, the Palestinian forces have ushered in revolutionary change, not just affecting occupied Palestine, but potentially the wider Middle East. The struggle for genuine sovereignty and national independence is renewed in all of these places that are dominated by comprador regimes now. Nothing will be the same again for any of them either, whether it's Sisi in Egypt or the Hashemite king in Jordan or the compradors in Lebanon or the monarchs in the Gulf states and Saudi. Nothing for them will ever be the same again either. And so when looking at this struggle, it is sometimes difficult not to get lost in the sheer horror of it all, because it is horrifying. It is absolutely disgusting seeing what the barbarities of imperialism do. But bear in mind, if we'd have had social media in the 1940s and 50s, you'd have got the similar pictures coming out of Algeria, similar pictures coming out of Korea or Vietnam. Now, we have been here before, and imperialism, for all its technological superiority, lost before and is losing now. So I would end this broadcast with an appeal to not get lost in the horror, to always bear in mind the history, and to know that the Palestinian struggle is the struggle of a strong people who have borne up under unbelievable amounts of repression and horror and are continuing their struggle heroically. It is down to us to build the movements inside our own nations, to further build the pressure on the US imperialist system, to direct the protests directly at the US occupation forces in Europe, to direct it at the NATO alliance, to put that into question, to push the ruling class to the point where they have to make a choice: preserve the NATO alliance, preserve the wider power of US imperialism, or preserve Israel. At that point, you raise the question in the minds of the bourgeois over whether preserving Israel is worth it anymore. And at that point, you see the whole thing collapse. And when the end comes, it will come far quicker than any of us could even imagine. So thank you for tuning in tonight. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, where we're going to be discussing some wider points from around the world, including the Bangladeshi garment workers' strike and the mass protests that have broken out amongst Panamanian workers, because it's a big scope of struggle out there, comrades. There's class struggles going on in so many parts of the world, and even though what is going on in Palestine, what is going on in Ukraine is incredibly important, we must not lose touch with the struggles of workers and oppressed peoples in other parts of the world. So I will be covering the events in Palestine and also touching on Ukraine tomorrow, but also we'll be drawing attention to Bangladesh and to Panama. So please join me for that. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in tonight. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory all through the